Welcome to Life Empowers with Melissa Oden. Where there is life, there is hope. Where there is life, there's a place for love to grow, and love emboldens and strengthens. Where there is life, there's an opportunity to grow and be empowered. I'm living testament to that, and you are too. And if you don't yet feel like your life is testament to this, don't despair and don't stop listening to this podcast. This is exactly why I'm doing it. Thanks for joining me this week as we delve into so many life-affirming topics. We know it's been a heavy week, well, really a heavy couple of weeks after the senseless killing of George Floyd. It doesn't matter how many times I think about it or say it, it always causes me to pause and hesitate and think about how to describe it. And honestly, I'm at the point even 2 weeks later almost where it's hard for me to put into words except tragic, senseless, and heartbreaking. And I know if people follow me on social media, you may know I put out a message earlier this week where I was talking about how the organization, the Abortion Survivors Network, what we had to say in the midst of George Floyd's passing and honoring his memory and the protests and really this emphasis for institutional change against institutional racism. And we put out what I thought was a beautiful graphic earlier in the week that really came from a photo. And the photo came out of Chicago last weekend when a company, it was Benchmark Real Estate, I believe it was named, they had experienced some damage from the protests, and their response was to spray paint on their boarded door, "We see you, we hear you, we love you." And after I saw that post from, I think it was a family member of someone who worked for that real estate agency, that photo, that image really stuck with me all week. And, it just kept rattling around in my head. And I know many people have put out social media posts similar to that this week. But for me, it meant so much. And I really hope it does for other people too when they're posting things saying, "We see you, we hear you, we love you," because I couldn't stop thinking about it, not only for our Black community, but it meant so much for me personally as a survivor. And so as I'm talking out loud in this, I guess, my point is, if you follow me on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, you'll probably see, or maybe even the Abortion Survivors Network, you will probably see, or you've seen that image, and you will have seen that I openly talked about the fact that I had tried to record this podcast, I don't know, Tuesday or Wednesday of last week. And in the middle of talking about this, I couldn't stop crying as I talked about his senseless killing, when I talked about the protests and people wanting to not only have this change instituted as it needs to be, but for those protesters to be seen, to be heard, and to know that they're loved. I was just sobbing. I was an absolute disaster last week as I was recording it. So had to delete both the audio and the video because nobody needed to listen to that. But I wanted to come back around to it because I do truly believe that people still need to hear the message that I wanted to share in the midst of that podcast as I was falling apart about it last week. And, first of all, the message will always remain true. George Floyd's passing never should have happened. It should never happen to another person. It should never happen to a Black person. They shouldn't be living in fear for their lives, depending on who they're in contact with. I mean, I hope all of us as Americans, and people around the world, can agree to that statement. There's nothing we should be arguing about in the middle of that. To me, that is pro-life. But in the midst of that, There's a few things that have been rattling around in my brain. In the midst of the conversation, I'm hoping that we can all at least admit that we don't understand everything that's happening. We don't understand necessarily the perspective of every protester, or even some of them. But I can't help but wonder, can't we just admit that we may not understand, but we stand with them? We stand with them even if we don't understand. And I think that's a huge part when we talk about, seeing people, hearing them, and loving them. Means we may not always understand, but it means that we're willing to stand with them. And for me, that's just so powerful. When I think about that whole statement of we see you, we hear you, we love you. I know that it can mean different things to different people when they're posting it. But, first of all, I want it to absolutely stand as what it is. That those protesters, everyone who is rallying for change, that they know that they are seen, that we are hearing them, and that they are heard, right? Not only do we need to hear, but they need to be heard at the highest levels of change within our country. But they also need to know that we love them. And, a friend said this so beautifully in the midst of this conversation the other day. She said, as we're talking about racism, certainly we shouldn't be making this about ourselves, right? But she said, instead of always bringing the focus back to whatever you want it to be, don't go there, right? Don't go there with the yeah, buts. Leave it out of it. Don't go there to say, oh, yes, I fight against racism, but but this other thing. So I don't want to go down that path because I want this to stand as it is. But I want to kind of circle back and relate it to what I see happening in the lives of survivors, because that will help explain why I was so affected by this whole conversation, not only about the death of George Floyd, but of those protesters who need to know that they are seen, they're heard, and they're loved. For me, as an abortion survivor and someone who works with abortion survivors around the world, I can tell you that we know what it's like to not be seen intentionally, to not be heard, to be silenced, to have our stories buried under the narrative of abortion as a right and a choice. We know what it's like to be unloved by our culture, to be told that we're a myth, a lie, something that's made up by the Republican establishment in order to push their agenda on abortion. We're people who somehow just wanted this story because we wanted to be famous. No. But I share that with you because it really does remind me so much as I'm watching everything happen in our nation and so many people who are hurting. It brings me to that place of my own pain as a survivor. And I don't want to make this about me or us. I want the attention to be focused on racism and the Black community who has been so impacted by this. But I share this with you because I want you to understand where all of this suffering has come from in the last week for me or so. I'm an empath. Some people probably would suspect that about me anyway. So I feel other people's feelings in a huge way. But for me to watch all of this trauma unfolding on the national stage, it reminds me so much of what I've gone through in my life, and I, in many ways, still go through in our culture that doesn't want to see, hear, or love survivors. And I, of course, live it out as I work with survivors every single day. So that statement, that image of we see you, we hear you, we love you, that's certainly part of why it affected me in such a huge way. But I read a couple other statements this week that really impacted me, and I want to share a couple of them with you. I'm going to keep this week's podcast short because for me, it's just about honoring George Floyd and allowing us to, really listen, to pause. I talked a lot about that in this podcast that I deleted earlier in the week. Can't we just practice the pause for once in our culture, for once in our lives, to truly see people, to truly listen to them, to hear them, and then give space enough to love them? For me, that's what it's about. We practice the pause. Instead of thinking about how we want to respond, how we want to judge people for the decisions they're making, if we just practice the pause, to see them, to hear them, to love them, isn't that what people who support the Abortion Survivors Network, or who have supported me over the years, isn't that what we've been asking for the media, for the abortion lobby, for politicians, for our greater culture? Isn't that what we've been asking them to do? To pause for a moment and see us, hear us, love us. When that happens for survivors, that's when we will see a true pro-life culture unfolding in our lives. I truly believe that that's what a culture of life is going to look like, where abortion survivors are seen and heard and loved, respected for what has happened to them, respected for who they are. So that's what gives me hope in the midst of this very tumultuous time in our culture. I know that those things can happen by the grace of God and by the goodness of people who are rallying for change. They're rallying for change right now. And just like you and I rally for change when it comes to the pro-life cause itself. So, that does give me hope. The other statement that I read this week that has been so powerful, and I want to share it with you. And it wasn't even directly associated to George Floyd's murder and the protests happening, but it relates back to it, I think, in a big way. The quote was from an author. And I now realize I don't have her name in my notes. Her first name is Peg. When I find it, I'll put the notes in my podcast notes. But it says, "For the healing self to thrive, it must have a voice." I want to say that again. For the healing self to thrive, it must have a voice. That was in a healing curriculum for family members who are healing from childhood trauma. And I was going through it and found it for the healing curriculum that I'm working on for the Abortion Survivors Network. But I thought it was so powerful for survivors, first of all, and really for all of us, for someone who has been wounded by something and we're healing, that healing self must have a voice to thrive. It doesn't mean you have to use that voice to take the public stage like I have, but it does mean you are able to have a voice, to speak up, to share your story, to maybe even whisper it, right, to someone that you don't even know. Maybe you have that voice and you can finally have a conversation with someone in your family that it's been difficult for you to talk to about whatever that experience is, or for survivors to be able to share your story or talk about that really difficult circumstance in your family of origin. And really, that's why the Abortion Survivors Network does the work that it does. Not only because we want to heal survivors and their families and ultimately our culture, but because we not only work through healing, we also help survivors and families find their voice and use their voice. That's what we're doing. That's what our advocacy is all about. It's for survivors and their families, and it's by survivors and their families. To me, it just doesn't get any better than that. That's how and why we do what we do. We realize that those healing individuals must have a voice. And I think it relates to what we see happening right now in our culture too. So many people have been so wounded for so long. That's why we see these protests happening, because this has gone on for far too long. And those individuals, for them to thrive, they must have a voice. Now, certainly I know people could argue about how they're using their voice, how they're finding that voice, and that's not the purpose of this podcast. I don't want to go there. I don't. What I want to do is hopefully give you that ability to pause and to think about the humanity of all of these individuals that you see, and think about how they need to have a voice. I think we can learn a lot about what happens when people don't have a voice, or they're made to feel like they don't. They're silenced, their stories are buried, they suffer. I could go on and on about that. But I just think that's such a powerful statement for all of us to recognize, especially if you're someone who works in ministry. For the healing self to thrive, it must have a voice. So I love that. And that's going to be something that I continue to put into practice in the Abortion Survivors Network. You know, I ended the podcast that I deleted earlier in the week by talking about a couple of Black pro-life leaders that I have been following, some for a long time, some who are new to me. And I just wanted to pass them along to you in case they're individuals that you haven't come into contact with or you're not following on social media. The first one would be Ryan Baumbarger with the Radiance Foundation. Ryan's an incredible guy. I love that he really focuses on more factivism, less activism, right? Ryan's very much the facts guy, but he's also very much a love guy. And I'm just so grateful for the wisdom that he offers up. So you can follow him, Ryan Baumbarger, Bombarger. Also follow the Radiance Foundation. Another person who I think would be a great resource for you would be my friend Christina, Christina Bennett, Bennett. You can find her on Facebook. You can find her on Twitter. You can find her on Instagram at Black Pro-Life Woman. You know, interestingly enough, I was going through some Facebook memories, and I believe yesterday was the day that a year ago, Christina and I testified together for a panel before Congress. It was a fascinating day. We were the only two pro-life witnesses on a panel of, if I remember right, 6 individuals. And but you know what? It was an amazing day, and I always love what Christina has to share, but that day in particular, her voice was just so powerful. And so follow Christina, and you will also see in Christina's post, she ultimately led me to someone else who I've just started following this last week and have really appreciated reading through his resources. He's, I believe, a pastor, and somebody can correct me later if I'm wrong on that. John Tremain, JonTremain, and his website is Civil Righteousness, civilrighteousness.org. And he has some great resources. I mean, he is out there, you know, feet on the ground, really mobilizing people into action, but to do so with wisdom and prayer. And so I've really appreciated on his website, there are resources you can download with meditations and just readings and reflections and, you know, steps that people can take for action. So I would encourage you to read through John's information at civilrighteousness.org. Follow him on social media. He has lots of great information to share. I got to take a deep breath. Honestly, I really feel like the podcast that I recorded earlier in the week was so much better in terms of everything that I had laid out to say. But frankly, this is also just from the heart. So maybe that's exactly what people need to hear this week is, yeah, that's what people need to hear. The hard stuff, the good stuff, the let's pause. Let's not always have all the answers. Let's be willing to say that it's been a hard week of reflection and that we care about all of our fellow man. Isn't that what being pro-life is truly all about. That's where I'm at this week. And I'm okay with that. I'd love to hear about where you're at with things in our world. I know it's been a crazy few months, but I do truly believe that God is moving in our world. And as always, he is going to bring about good. I know he's bringing about good, even right now in the midst of George Floyd's passing and these protests. I know that God will redeem this loss and he will use it for the good of humanity. So send me an email, mohden@gmail.com. Reach out to me, Instagram, Twitter, find me on Facebook. Let me know how you're doing. And let me know maybe who I could have on as a guest for a future podcast. I need to get focused now this week after I've processed some of this out and add some new guests for a future podcast. So drop me a comment. Let me know. Let me know how I can pray for you. Thanks for joining me this week on Life Empowers. I hope you found our time together to be life-affirming, hope-building, encouraging, informative. And remember, the next time someone states that abortion is empowering, you know better. Life empowers. See you again next week.